So I think I can take the role of Stella for a while until it's gonna get reconnected. Yeah. And once we have here, I think we can move on with Stella rolling.
I'm back, Stephanie. It happened sooner than what I was expecting, but it's a nice start. Okay, thank you very much for hosting this session in this conference. The aim is basically to link a bit into the wider discussion of policy changes and challenges in the Eurasia region, the topic of energy, and especially all these ongoing developments with regards to energy transition, sustainable energy sources, renewable energy sources, and how all these will impact on the regional outcome, on cooperation outcomes, and also on the development of the region. But not only of the region, also of the global community, given the immense challenges that this energy transition has to address in the years to come. So I'm very happy to chair this session, and with me, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm coming from the University of Ioannina in Greece. I'm an economist, and I'm privileged today to be surrounded by esteemed colleagues from the Central Asia region, and not only. So let me introduce you, let me make a brief introduction of them. We have Murodbek Laldjebaev, I pronounced it correctly, I hope, from the University of Central Asia. We have Zhanat Murzakulova from Germany. I'm sorry, Zhanat, I don't know German, so I'll try to say it how is it is. Deutsche Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit.
Zusammenarbeit.
Good, thank you, Zhanat, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have Katerina Tsakmakidou from Rhodes, the Municipality on Rhodes in Greece, and the Aegean University. We have Heracles Polatidis from Uppsala University. And then we will wrap up this series of presentations with a presentation of mine from the University of Ioannina, representing basically the research that we do there. So without wasting any time on this, I give the floor to Murodbek for his presentation on renewable energy in Central Asia. He's going to provide an overview of potential deployment, outlook, and barriers in the region. Murodbek, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, dear audience. Thanks so much, Stella, for the introductions. Let me see if I can share my screen first. Looks like I can. So, can I get a quick confirmation that everyone can see the screen, please? Okay, great.
Yes, we can see it, Murodbek.
Okay, so the topic is renewable energy in Central Asia, an overview of potential deployment, outlook, and barriers. This is based off of a paper that we recently had out in the Energy Reports Journal by my colleagues from Kyrgyzstan, Ruslan Isaev, and from Kazakhstan, Maza Saukhimov. So you can see the link over here, just in case everyone wants to get a deeper understanding. Feel free to dive in. It should be available, but if I mean, it's open access, but in case you guys struggling, just let me know and I'll be happy to share the actual paper. Okay, so the outline for presentation today is the purpose of renewable energy, the knowledge status of the same in Central Asia, our study contributions, and then we dive directly into the renewable energy potential, deployment, outlook, identify some barriers, propose some general recommendations, and conclude. As you know, renewable energy is derived from the natural processes. These are the sources that are replenished at a faster rate than they are consumed. And essentially all forms of energy produced from renewable sources in a sustainable manner here include bioenergy, geothermal energy, hydropower, ocean energy, solar energy, and wind energy. We consider small-scale hydropower plants, but we do not consider large-scale hydropower because its renewability is subject to debate given the construction costs and some of the reservoir and relocation concerns. Globally, countries pursue renewable energy for two reasons, and in Central Asia, they're also applicable. The first reason is to be able to meet the increasing energy demand. And here I'm basically showing electric power consumption per capita for the Central Asian countries. You can see most notably Kazakhstan increasing very fast, but the rest are also increasing, although there have been some ups and downs in the middle. The second objective, of course, in the sustainability agenda is decarbonizing the energy supply. And so here I'm just showing the CO2 emissions in kilotons. Again, you can see most visibly Kazakhstan, but other countries may be somewhat less, or having more or less stable emissions, such as Uzbekistan, and maybe with a slightly downward trend. But nonetheless, this data is a little outdated from 5 years ago. Then there may have been some changes ever since. What is the knowledge status on renewable energy in Central Asia? Well, most of the studies that we've looked at are one country analysis. One of these Central Asian countries is discussed, in mostly Kazakhstan. Probably there's been a lot of international attention to the oil and gas sector, and so most of the publications are focused on Kazakhstan and renewable energy included in those studies. Next, we've seen that there's a focus on large-scale hydropower and water energy nexus, especially in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And of course, the nexus includes the downstream countries of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan as well, and the associated disputes, if not outright conflicts. In terms of Uzbekistan, there is a growing interest in developing renewable energy, particularly large-scale solar, but also wind energy. And it's very unfortunate that for Turkmenistan, we do not have publicly available information. There are very few studies available on this. In general, there is a lack of comprehensive information for all 5 Central Asian countries on these renewable energy resources. And therefore, our paper makes a first of its kind of contribution towards bridging this gap. So we do this by looking at all 5 Central Asian countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. We look at 5 renewable energy sources, from small-scale hydropower to solar to wind to geothermal and bioenergy. We look at 4 aspects: potential, deployment, outlook, and barriers. And we aim to provide a comprehensive, but at the same time, a concise overview so that the scholars, practitioners, and policymakers can obtain this information very efficiently, but also consult the references for more detailed information. Okay, now into the meat of the discussion. Renewable energy potential has been estimated variously in these different studies. And what we show in this table are some of the ones that we believe are more or less reliable in terms of the estimates. Although I should point out here that many of these studies do not specify the methodology for determining the potential. Even though they have included a specific number in the studies, it is very difficult to know how they arrived at those estimates. So we are facing essentially 2 issues here. One is that there are a variety of numbers for potential given, and then there are the ones that are given do not specify their methodology. Nonetheless, we can see it from this graph and also on the side that the renewable energy potential is quite substantial. For solar energy, from 195,000 to over 3 million megawatts. For wind energy, the lower bound is a bit lower, 1,500, and the higher bound is 354,000 megawatts. For small scale, it's only 275 at the lower bound, and 300,000 megawatts at the highest. Geothermal from just 2 about 54,000 megawatts, and bioenergy between 200 and 800 megawatts. Now, this is across Central Asia, and of course, for each of the countries, you can look at the table, and most noticeably, you can see that the column on solar PV shows the greatest potential, and then we have wind energy in Kazakhstan, most prominent, and in Turkmenistan. Geothermal is in Kazakhstan, and bioenergy is in Uzbekistan, whereas small-scale hydropower is mostly in Tajikistan. So those are some of the differences. In general, you can see that Kazakhstan pretty much tops everyone else in terms of the potential. Regardless or despite that massive renewable potential, deployment remains very limited. And this limited deployment is usually related to a number of barriers that we will talk about in the subsequent slides. But in general, the biggest issue is, of course, the financial availability and the existing policies supporting the current system, which is based on fossil fuels. Nonetheless, we can see that in terms of renewable energy development, Kazakhstan is essentially in the lead, and it has pretty much developed in all of these 4 renewable energy sources, most aggressively on the solar, but also wind. Whereas the rest of the countries, these deployments are not significant or no data is available. And of course, small-scale hydropower is very limited too. Again, we are not considering large-scale hydropower, just you bear that in mind. What about the outlook? Well, the outlook seems to be extremely positive. We've looked at a number of policies, documents, strategies, and essentially all of the Central Asian countries do recognize that they have to meet the increasing energy demand, and they have to, at the same time, pursue the sustainability agenda, meaning that they are aiming to decarbonize their energy supply. Now, these are essentially policy statements or laws and programs that have been either developed or updated. However, when it comes to the actual implementation, there is a lot of room for improvement. What does this mean? It basically means that the legislation is there, the programs are there, the strategies are adopted, some targets are being pronounced. But when you look at the actual deployment, as we've seen in the previous slide, very little has actually been developed. Again, the notable exception is, of course, Kazakhstan. So this leaves a lot of room for such a conference as this one that talks that focuses on the policy, that to what extent you craft a policy that is effective, but also it is actionable, which is implementable. This leads us to the barriers, and there are many. And again, we begin with the regulatory framework, with these laws and policies and programs, etc. And we can clearly see that there is a continued support of fossil fuels through subsidies, and there isn't much of the regulation towards curbing the use of the fossil fuels in all of the countries. Of course, we are excluding essentially Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan to some extent, because largely they depend on large-scale hydropower. Of course, in the domestic sector, we have still issues with coal consumption, but also in the rural areas in terms of wood and burning of the livestock manure. So those are still, they're not fossil fuels, of course, but they're still emitting greenhouse gas emissions, not to say the indoor air pollution, which is a cause of mortality in these areas. So continued support is there, and it's a barrier for development of renewable energy. Basically, the money goes to the fossil fuels instead of to the renewables. Then in terms of the framework, there's less clarity. The conditions for investors are not always clear, and then the regulations and enforcement are not robust, meaning that, on the one hand, you want to attract the investment, but at the same time, the legislation does not seem to be quite transparent or clear on the conditions and what kind of regulations exist. Another interesting barrier, or rather not so interesting for the investors, of course, is this frequent changes in the in the legislation. Because if every time you keep on changing the legislation, it scares away the investors because they do not see a consistency in your policies. And what if they invest and you decide to change your laws and their investments will be trapped? So this is a huge barrier for development of the renewable energy.
Murodbek, sorry to interrupt you. I have this bad role here to keep track of time. So please bear in mind that there are 3 minutes left. Thank you.
Yes, I do have it up on my screen so I can see it. Thanks for the reminder though. And next, we have these unclear and overlapping roles in terms of the responsibilities of different institutions, that you may have 2 or more of these different institutions that are regulating the energy sector. So moving forward, we have the infrastructure, which is outdated. There are lots of technical challenges in terms of integrating renewables. And of course, the topography, especially the mountain terrain, makes it very difficult, as well as the lack of roads to transport the equipment. I've mentioned already finances. Some countries, except probably for Kazakhstan, they don't have really the local financing mechanisms. There's a high capital cost for this. Low price of conventional energy is another issue, and there's lack of funding for scientific research. And of course, currency depreciation also weighs in. In terms of expertise, again, because of low salaries, we don't have the qualified personnel to be able to develop, design, finance, build, operate, and maintain the renewable energy projects. And then at the larger scale, we have lack of awareness and support in terms of the renewable energy at the population and policy levels. And the last one is basically data and information. As I already indicated, there are issues about the data, being it up to date, the lack of methodology. There's not much research ongoing on this. And of course, monitoring and evaluation are also problematic in terms of implementation. So what do we recommend? Well, basically recommend that these obstacles are very interrelated. So therefore, a cross-sector and integrated approach is necessary. Then we need a critical evaluation of the performance of these different technologies just to make sure that they actually work. And then we need to tap into the regional cooperation scholarship, especially water energy nexus, to see how we can do a regional one. And then learning, of course, from other countries and regions. And of course, further research is required on the performance of these technologies. So I will conclude again, there's a substantial energy, but marginal deployment. Kazakhstan is making good lead. Overall, renewable energy outlook is very positive, again, with Kazakhstan in the lead, and the rest have some issues. There are these important barriers, and what we recommend is a systematic approach. And hopefully, addressing these barriers will lead towards greater energy access and greening of the energy supply. So I'll leave you guys with my contacts here, and again, the link to the paper. Thanks for your attention. I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Murodbek, for this very interesting presentation. I think it's best if we move now to questions related to Murodbek's work. So any comments, any questions for the audience, from the audience?
Yeah, if
Yes,
I may ask.
please.
Yeah. Thanks, Murodbek. Thanks a lot. Just an issue that we have discussed quite a few times. I mean, because you mentioned about the estimations, the very high divergence in the estimations, in the data, right? That it goes from very low to very high. Is that you think lack of data that makes these things happen, or it's methodology, kind of a weak methodology or inconsistency? Why do we have so high variations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. We've really tried to understand why this is happening. And this other chapter that you and I have written on the large-scale hydropower, same issues remain. So it seems, I mean, please don't take it as an evidence, but it's my my opinion that these mostly happen because of the lack of a sound methodology. How you estimate it. because essentially these guys are getting the numbers from either the satellites, especially for solar energy and for wind energy. And some of these models may be aggregate at the like global models, and not so much, specifically for each country. And so that results in the kind of the data that you have, and then the kind of the estimate that you get. So I think it's more of the methodology of how do you do this is the first. And those that are not based on the global models, they rely on whatever the ministries of energy or whoever is in the government is giving this data. And there have been issues with the reliability of that kind of data, not only for energy, but for pretty much everything else of what is existing and what is not existing. And so essentially, we did not see anyone except for probably CatGat organization that have done their own data collection. And so that is the issue, essentially. And that's why we are proposing that research should be done to collect our own data to actually get at this. Not quite probably precisely it will be possible, but at least a more robust estimate than what we have currently.
Thank you, Maksat. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Murodbek, for your question, for your presentation. I have a question mostly related to your research plans for your future analysis and studies in the area. You have done a great job on the overview of the situation with renewables in Central Asia. What I'm interested in is the question about the incentives for public managers and policymakers in the area in Central Asian countries, how different they are, and have you looked at the motivational behavioral aspects of the policy leaders in Central Asia in regard to each other, and maybe you look at the regional differences in terms of the demand for renewable energy, because we all know that in transitional context, most of the funding and support for the innovation there comes mostly from the public sector, or in some cases from the international arena. You mentioned in your paper the support that was given by the international arena, even in Kazakhstan, right? In the vicinity of Astana, we built certain solar panels and the related infrastructure capacity with the help of the Asian Development Bank. So whether you are going to look also to the aspects of support from the private sector, from the corporate sector, which is would be an indication that there is a certain demand from other stakeholders rather than those who are mostly focusing on policy aspects of the research question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. Indeed, this is, I mean, interest in this topic emerged mostly because we wanted to see specifically how much of this renewable energy actually is developed in Central Asian countries. And when we struggle to see the kind of exact numbers in these different studies and reports and policy and programs, then eventually this grew up in terms of, okay, let's see how about the potential, and then let's see how about, you know, the other aspects. And so it grew into from a mere curiosity into this kind of a paper just outlining the gaps. We have some findings, but the gaps. In terms of the financing, yeah, you're right. I mean, currently the government or the public sector is essentially the main contributor of the finances, with some, you know, support from international organizations in terms of these installations. However, as also mentioned in the paper very briefly about these auctions in Kazakhstan, which is a very good innovation, and we've seen quite substantial uptake, and actually the supply, which means you know, the auction bids actually surpassed the amount that was put on the auction, which showing that the demand from the public side was kind of low, but the supply, the private sector companies were very eager to take up more. There were more bids than there could be energy given. So in Kazakhstan, this is showing very good promise, and it looks like the private sector has now confidence, and that's very important for the private sector, that they are sure. But of course, we have to recognize that Kazakhstan has been in the energy business, including working with international or multinational, rather, private companies in the oil sector. And so the confidence is there, and then the renewable is following that, which is not necessarily the case for the rest of the country. So when you think of this behavior and how the policy can be done, this history does play a huge role. Now we have an interesting experiment in Uzbekistan about to happen. They are going to liberalize the energy market, and specifically they are looking at the price, electricity price liberalization, which is a huge endeavor for Uzbekistan. And so I'm working with a couple of colleagues to see the impact on the vulnerable households. That's kind of my main bread when I'm looking at these remote and rural and poor and access to energy. So what does this mean? They have looked at the case of Kazakhstan, and they've seen that the auctions are helping, that the actual price is actually, it is cost efficient. And so they want to do something similar in Uzbekistan. It already shows some kind of a policy diffusion among Central Asian countries. Now, whether or not this is going to diffuse further into into Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan is debatable, because they are very strong in terms of the large-scale hydropower and believe that they're already renewable, and the rest is just nonsense. I'm being very open here, in my opinion. And for Turkmenistan, we can't really say much because, again, very little information is available. So I think to answer your last question is in terms of the private sector support, I think Kazakhstan is really showing great promise. And the fact that Uzbekistan is already thinking about this and planning to do it is showing that the private sector involvement role is going to increase. And hopefully we'll be able to see further diffusion down the road. Thanks.
Thank you, Murodbek. Just a reminder to the audience and the presenters that we have about 8 minutes for comments and questions. So I'm sorry that I really have to cut off this Q&A session. Zhanat, I see your hand, so please feel free to contact Murodbek via email, because I see he has kindly shared his contact information for any questions. To keep track again of time, I give the floor to you. And right. Any other questions or comments, please feel free to directly address them to Murodbek.
Or type them in the chat.
Or in the chat, even better. So Zhanat, until you upload your presentation and you share your screen, let me do the introduction. And actually it's a very good follow-up presentation, because it's all about drivers of policy change in Kazakhstan. We've seen already that Kazakhstan is a driving case and country in the region. So let's see now what does this mean for local suppliers and local content in the oil and gas industry. Zhanat, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. And I hope you can see my presentation. Okay.
Yes, we can, Zhanat. If you can put full screen mode, it would be even better.
Better now?
Perfect now. It's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. When I switch to my screen, you also switch to, right? No?
We still see the PPT version, not the full screen one. So probably you've shared the PowerPoint and not the screen.
Okay, let me then check. Oh, just one moment. And now you can see it?
We can see it, but not in the full screen mode yet. We can see it now, yes.
Okay, so
Great, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak at this conference. So, my name is Zhanat Murzakulova, and I work at the German Agency for International Cooperation, and this is the place where I work. But this research paper is actually based on my research, which is done within the University of Groningen. So my paper is about the policy change under SIG institution, and I'm more focused on discussing this the process of development of local suppliers of oil and gas machinery and equipment in Kazakhstan. So today, I think in the morning, we had a very interesting session, and one of the speakers, Professor Zauresha Takhano, she was also discussing the role of oil boom for development of services, of intermediate services in Kazakhstan. So my work is also to some extent related to this area of research, but I'm more focused on the goods side. And also this discussion that we just had before this session about the corporate social responsibility of companies, especially these international companies working in extractive industries, for example, in Kazakhstan, is also to some extent relevant to my research. So let me first talk about my motivation about this study. So my departure point was the basically economic theory, and my motivation was this unbalanced growth theory, which was proposed by Albert Hirschman, a very famous classic in development economics. So basically what he was saying is, when you have this outlier sector or outlier industry in your economy, this could create a good inducement mechanism for the growth process in the country. So what I have done in my research, I took the oil industry, which represents the outlier sector, and I looked at how its development impacted the process of emergence of new domestic industries, specifically supply industries. The focus of my research is on three largest oil fields, Tengiz, Kashagan, and Karachiganak, and basically I'm discussing only international oil companies working in Kazakhstan. So what the available statistical data shows that basically these companies are actually procuring a lot of, let's say, goods and services. And for example, if we take the local procurement for these three largest oil fields in 2020, this was almost about 3% of GDP, which is, I would say, a substantial amount, and it's a huge market for the local goods and services. But what we still see that there is this potential, but still we cannot say that the market for goods, especially for these technically complex goods, are very much developed, and local producers are kind of competitive on this market. And this is one of the areas which was also addressed by the Kazakh government, and the intervention on this market was substantial. So in my research, I kind of focused on examining the drivers of this policy change, and basically exploring this process, how development of these local suppliers of oil and gas machinery and equipment was happening in Kazakhstan. So my analysis started first from this discussion of what actually are the institutions that are shaping industrial policy in Kazakhstan. And based on the literature review and review of state planning documents and media information, so I kind of based
Zhanat,
my analysis.
Sorry to interrupt you again. Sorry to interrupt you. I still need to keep reminding the time limitation. So please bear in mind 5 more minutes.
Yes. So I basically found that, or kind of generalized 3 main factors describing these institutions shaping industrial policy, which is the state capacity, the governments, and human agency. By state capacity, I mean that the general kind of quality of bureaucracy in the country, to what extent this bureaucracy is separated from the politicians, and to what extent there is this specific pilot agency in place. And by governance, I mean how things are done. So basically, this is the practice on coordination and collaboration between different stakeholders in the process of policymaking. And the last one is the human agency, which is kind of related to the practice, which is still possible in Kazakhstan, the personalized application of rules, and this to more kind of to larger extent also affects the belief system of different stakeholders like entrepreneurs and, for example, and also the bureaucrats. So this kind of three parameters represent the institutional framework around the policies. And still, despite this kind of weak institutional setting, I see that the economic reforms are very much dynamic. And my next question was about, so what drives these policies to change actually? And basically, I found that there are 5 main drivers driving this gradual policy change. And so this strong political will, and we have to make distinction between the political will and the capacity, which actually I just discussed that the state capacity is still weak in Kazakhstan. And increased bargaining power of the state, which is also determined by the dynamics of oil prices. So as oil prices go up, the bargaining power of the states actually improves. And then there is also a dynamic learning process. So the state learns in this process, and the policy tools, they become more tailored, more kind of strict, and more comprehensive. The next driver is also the corporate culture and governance that exists within those international lead oil firms. As the previous session showed that the oil firms, they have a different, let's say, appetite for supporting development of local economy and local communities. And this also is very important driving factor. And the last one is over time, all these factors acting together, they still contribute to increased local absorptive capacity. And this again, kind of in this virtuous cycle opens the way to kind of for local suppliers to enter the supply chain of oil companies. So based on this, my conclusion is that though, yes, we do see that there is a very dynamic process of creating new rules for specific industry, but still it's kind of shaped by this high-level institutional framework, which is still very much rigid and not much dynamic as, for example, in economic policy case. And this really removes this dynamism from this process of economic diversification. And this is the long-standing agenda in Kazakhstan. So, and basically my finding is that the policy change, despite its dynamism, had a limited transformative power due to the stable institutional setting around it. And those institutions allow for policy change to happen. They still stumble along this weak implementation and formal kind of application of rules. So this is it from my side, and I'm open for any follow-up questions and discussion or comments.
Thank you very much, Zhanat. Given the time, we have some minutes for one question, and the rest can follow in the chat room or via email. So any questions or comments for Zhanat? Okay, I don't see any hands on, so I will grab this opportunity, Zhanat, and make a comment and the question basically. Given this strong presence of oil and gas companies and the existence of the local supply chain and the strong links that they have with supply chain, how do you think this impacts the deployment of renewable energy sources in Kazakhstan? Is it some kind of institutional structural barrier that any investment in renewable energy has to overcome in the country?
Well, I would say this is kind of a next step maybe, because still Kazakhstan, I mean, very much now relying on oil, but we do also see that the global trend is actually exiting from fossil fuels, and basically Kazakhstan has no other choice to join the trend. And I know that this is what Kazakhstan is doing now, because there is a long-term low-emission development strategy for Kazakhstan that has been developed just recently. And yesterday, the president of Kazakhstan already announced that Kazakhstan is willing to introduce this doctrine, which is a very high-level state planning document. And this doctrine will basically show how Kazakhstan will be actually departing on the path of decarbonized economic growth. So over time, this will require taking actions to restructure everything, not only the supply chain of oil and gas industry, but the entire economy, and not only the economy, but also the belief system and basically mental constructs of the citizens. And this is a very long way ahead.
Okay, thank you. Ainur Musabekova, can we have your quick question, please?
Thank you very much. Zhanat, just a quick question. Thank you for this interesting analysis, as I'm working in one of these major oil operators. Just curious, during your analysis, you mentioned that in 2020, the average share of local procurement for the oil and gas industry reached 46%, and three operators provided 78% of this local procurement. So I'm just curious, what are the, do you have the breakdown of that services or products that has been procured from local suppliers by operators? And for the last like 30 years, over 25 years of operation in the country, have they been able to support or promote development of local suppliers here? And if yes, which local suppliers? Thank you.
No, this is the aggregated data. So I have some of the disaggregated data, for example, for very specific like equipment and, for example, tools or machineries. But this is the aggregated data.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zhanat. And we also have a very nice comment in the chat that we need to consider technological innovation and change that basically is one other factor that will drive changes in the region. Well noted. Thank you, Abdul. And we are on time now. Thank you, Zhanat. We are on time to continue with the next presenter, Katerina Tsakmakidou from the University of Aegean and the Municipality of Rhodes. Let's take a bird's eye view and introduce large regional and also global players in the energy scene, China being one of those. So let's hear your analysis, Katerina.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Ioannina, thank you very much for inviting me in this conference. As a matter of fact, I was part of this conference last year. I was watching as a participant and found it very interesting. So I decided this year, why not being one of the presenters, if possible. So I sent we sent our abstract. It was accepted, and well, let's go on with the presentation now. Can you all see the view of my slide?
Yes, we can.
Is it in a full screen mode? Is it full screen?
Yes, it is full screen.
Perfect. Well, I would like to thank Zhanat for her comments on the drivers of policy change, because policies is what I would like also to talk about. And when I mentioned policy, my mind goes to politicians. I had my PhD with the University of the Aegean on the contribution of local politicians in climate protection, and this is a subject that lies close to my heart. And what is the role of the local policymakers, the politicians, on the local level? And being in trend now is the China, the big game changer. So we're going to discuss partly what is going to be there, what we're going to go there, because actually this is a Euro-Asia conference, and I thought we should have a mention to the outside EU players. So just to start with a quick view of the agenda, talking about the local actors and analyzing their experiences and contexts. And also, as I mentioned, China is the new player, and we'll see some things about their timeline, how is it evolving, and we'll end with a conclusion. This nice photo is from Gothenburg in Sweden. It's a very nice city. It's one of the first cities in the EU that have a policy for the climate change, and Sweden is among the countries in the EU that they have taken a lead in this process. It is true, as we all know, that the cities consume energy. They consume around 78%, according to the UN Habitat of the energy, and of course they produce greenhouse emissions. All those cities, they don't expand as countries. Their size is a small percentage of the global sphere. But however, they have this huge impact on environment. So in order to understand the climate change issues, we don't need only to see what is emission, energy sources, but there is also socio-economic factors. They interact with science and with policy. And in this triangle, we should find our place for the politicians. I'm just discussing now the policymakers. How are they going to improve or worsen the situation by their actions and initiatives? The science has, also in 1999, there was a study on the issue. The researchers have tried to find a way to talk science into the local policymakers, to see how we can link the global problems to the local factors, and exactly how is this possible. So they're framing this, and Wilbanks and Kate, they make 3 suggestions for the research in this area. We should develop, they think, a bottom-up paradigm to meet the top-down paradigm midway. And of course, there is a need to develop a protocol for studies, for the local area studies, for the climate change issues. So we could compare case studies, local case studies, local issues solved by the local actors. This has been so we have a large amount now of case studies of municipalities in the research and the bibliography compared to each other, and useful outcomes are derived after this analysis. And of course, what they have proposed, and it is true till today, is a long-term monitoring and observation of these case studies. It's not enough to pinpoint them and see what they are, but long-term to analyze them, because sometimes a situation changes and we don't have the same impacts when we have a change in government, for example. The local council is not always the same. Every 4 years or every 5 years, something new happens. So the monitoring is very, very important in this case. Now, just to see how the local actors, the politicians, have responded to the climate change. We start in 1990 with the Climate Alliance. It is very important because just before, even before the protocol of Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol, or the UN, the Rio Convention in '92, we had some mayors who met, European mayors, municipalities, who met with mayors from the Amazon area, and they made the Climate Alliance. They were German mayors at first. It was a German initiative. It was called Klima Alliance, Klima, and they started to implement local action plans. They said we will start, and there were more than 100 of these plans in a few years leading to the Kyoto Protocol. Today, there are more than 1,800 municipalities in this group, and they are still working, and they make progress, and they publish their reports yearly, and I think it's one of the first pioneers in the area. And of course, later on, we have the Rio Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and we finally were here in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, the decision to be neutral, climate neutral by 2050. And here, like a new threshold, we have China's pledge to be neutral by 2060. It is a challenge because China is a very big country, and we are very interested to see how it will evolve if this pledge is going to realize. But given the history of China and their long-term planning, it seems very possible. And with this, change, we will see a very big impact on the whole emission and the carbon footprint of the planet. Now, but going back to municipalities, these are some of the mitigation tools they can use as research in bibliography. Municipalities, they have a strong impact on land use planning, urban development policies, investments in infrastructure. They decide and they construct infrastructure in most cases, and also renewable energy sources in many areas. Spatial planning for renewable areas has to be discussed and approved by the local authorities, regional or municipal. And in the end, of course, they have the decision making for schools, park, and recreation areas. involving the carbon sinks, the green areas, the places that need to be free from any building and available for people to enjoy. This is not a common ground in many Greek cities. We lack parks and recreation areas within them, the urban areas. And although there are countries that and cities that they are forward and they take initiatives, like in Sweden, they have a better understanding, or in Germany as well, about what the need is for recreation areas within the urban areas, the urban structure. Now, one of the barriers that they are common when the cities or the politicians plan or implement these policies, the first I would say is the lack of political will. In many cases, we don't see the will of the politicians to implement climate changes. They may say so, but it needs something more than a promise. It needs a strong will to implement and go forward. And of course, sometimes we have seen the lack of knowledge. Some politicians, they don't know exactly what is the problem or what are the available tools to help solve it. And in other areas, there is also a lack of clarity between who is responsible, the national authorities or the local authorities, what is the legal ground and who is responsible after all for the implementation or the creation of these tools. Now, let's go back to China. As we discussed in the beginning, they have this new and ambitious targets. They want to peak the carbon dioxide emissions around 2030, and of course lower the carbon dioxide, the emissions 60 to 65% from 2005 levels by 2030. The 2005 levels is going to be the ground level, and everything has to be lower than that. And of course, increase the share from fossil fuels in the primary energy to around 20% by 2030. And what is very interesting for me, because I am an agronomist and I like very close to green areas, they promise to increase the forest stock volume, and this is very important. They are thinking of adding 4.5 billion cubic meters to the national stock by 2030. I think it is a very big target, and I would be very glad to see. I see there are a lot of organized plans of reforestation of arid zones on the borders to Mongolia, and they are going very well, and they've been there for decades. So I am optimistic about it. Now, the Chinese cities, going back there, they are very big cities, and according to research, big cities like Handan, Shanghai, Suzhou, or Beijing, they are in the top sources, and each of these cities have 3 times the emissions of New York City, just to compare. So it is a very big challenge, and China is now using a 7 different tools policy, as you can see in the diagram, to combat this crisis and to lower the carbon emissions. And one of these 7, which is very interesting, is the pilots. Planning, target, strategy, laws and regulations, investment, financing, market mechanism, and the pilots in this case. The pilots, they are cities or regions who are selected pilots as a pilot, and they are encouraged to lower their emissions and to invest in new energy sources, in alternative sources. So it started in 2008 with 2 cities, the Green Cities program with Shanghai and Baoding. Then in 2010, we have 5 provinces and 8 cities. In 2016, it is
Katerina, sorry to interrupt you. 3 minutes, just a reminder.
Yes, we're almost finished, don't worry. I'm almost finished, thank you. So we are now in 30 cities, and this goes on. So early this year in April, the President Xi Jinping, he said in the Beijing Leaders Summit for Climate that we should protect nature, we should preserve the environment, like our eyes, and try to foster a new relationship where man and nature can both prosper and live in harmony. This is a very strong statement, and to protect the environment like our eyes is something that we in Greece, we have it also as a saying, just to stay with us. It has stayed with me when I read it. So concluding, cities could be or would be the focal point of change. They have the innovative tools and they have in their responsibilities the power to implement them. The Chinese local authorities, it seems that they respond well to the central government's expectation and they take actions. It is more important in China because it is a different governance system to follow the central government's mandate, and sometimes these mandates are respected to the T. It is very, very important. They are not taken very lightly. And of course, the politicians and the decision makers are in need of the support of NGOs and networks, because as it was apparent in research, municipalities alone, without the national government or some support network around them, they cannot operate. They need a network. We have similar networks in Europe, and they need the NGOs because the NGOs always bring something extra to the game. So that's for references. And that's the end of it. I hope I have took no time from the next presenter, and I hope
Perfectly.
we have time for questions.
Perfectly on time, Katerina. Thank you very much. We have 8 minutes for questions and comments. I see Murodbek already raising his hand. So Murodbek, please.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to ask a question, and thanks, Katerina, for such an interesting presentation on China. I recently read a paper, now I can't remember exactly the title or the authors, but I'll be able to dig it up. But the main issue that they were raising with regards to these climate policies in China is this so-called decentralization and re-centralization moves that have been taking place. So first, the policy have been devolved from the central government to the municipalities, down below to the lowest level, and then somehow the accountability have been re-centralized. So what this has created, and the case studies were around the Beijing area and around the time of the Olympics games, which was a big issue, the pollution, to move all of these polluting industries out of the Beijing area, and at the same time try to shut down some of them or relocate, etc. And so the challenge that the policymakers at the local levels were facing was not so much of the financing, but what do you do when you receive this kind of policy instruction from the top? If 40 to 50% or even more of your economy depends on these steel industry or cement or whatever, using essentially coal and other fossil fuels, what do you do? What are the employment opportunities? And at the same time, the Chinese have introduced these so-called key performance indicators, or some sort of indicators for evaluating performance of the policymakers. And then the policymakers then, not the policymakers, but what do you call them? The government officials with the executive agency, executive branch, has been really struggling to deliver on multiple criteria. On the one hand, you have to perform on your economic development, on job creation, social policy, and in addition to that, you have to also perform on the decarbonizing. And so this has been a great challenge, and I'm really curious to hear what your thoughts are, because I remember this paper was a bit older, from 2011 or 2012 or so. So just to see how the update is went.
Yes, it is very, I know exactly what you mean, because I have read the same paper. some municipalities have found a way out of it. There was a conflict there. You're right about the goals, the decarbonization goals, and the climate protection goals, and the local development goals. So what they did was that they saved on energy, and saving energy was part of was dealing with two fronts, let's say. Saving energy was good for the environment, the emissions were down, but it was also good for the economy because they were saving on fuel. They were changing their mix of fuel. They were not abandoning the coal industry, but they were introducing new alternative sources of energy. And in the end, they had a positive outcome. But it is a challenge, and there was conflict. I know exactly what you mean about it. Yes, you're totally right about it. It is a conflict because China is all about growth, growth, growth. But they have decided that this is the 2005 growth is the maximum, so they're not going to push for more growth targets now in the small regions and municipalities. They are lowering the expectations. I'll be happy to send you more literature on this one.
Okay. Thank you, Katerina. Any other comments or questions? Good. So it seems that we are perfectly on time again to pass to our next presenter. Thank you, Katerina, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And now allow me to give the floor to Heracles Polatidis from Uppsala University. He will present about the decarbonization of island grids, policy change imperatives for energy planning in transition, and environmental repercussions. Heracles, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Heracles, we can hear you now.
Okay, I will get rid of this. Can you see my screen also?
Yes, we can see it, not in full screen mode though.
Yes. What about now?
Now it's perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone from Sweden. It is a rainy and windy morning here in Visby, as usual of this time. I would like to thank the organizer for giving us the opportunity to present our research and to take part in this conference and exchange ideas with colleagues. So I will present you today the research we do at the Department of Earth Science, Uppsala University in Sweden, about the way to decarbonize islands and Icelandic grids, and we will present you the results of the European Horizon 2020 project that we are working on now. So, the presentation outline, I will just give you a short introduction, then present you the project and the main methodology we use for decarbonizing Icelandic grids, then some application of the framework and the relevance that this application will have for mainland grids, like in Central Asia countries, and then the findings and the next steps. So islands, both geographic and energy islands in the mainlands, like for remote communities and cities in Central Asian countries, big countries like Kazakhstan, largely currently depend on fossil fuel for their electricity production. This is gradually changing, and local renewables are entering the mix together with energy storage. This is not a simple process, and decarbonization is far more than installing new renewable energy capacity, but it has to be embedded and operationalized in an appropriate way in the current energy systems. So this is what the REACT Horizon 2020 project is doing, called the Renewable Energy for Sustainable Island Communities. This is a project that it was started in 2019, and so we are a little bit more than half of it now, and will end at the end of 22 now with a little bit more time extension to 2023. So this is about the project to investigate possible ways to decarbonize the electricity grids of different islands in the EU and Icelandic networks in the mainland. It includes 24 partners from all around the EU. Uppsala University is one of the main academic contributors, together with the University of the Aegean in Greece and the Fraunhofer Institute of Science and Technology in Germany and the Austrian Institute of Technology in Austria. So we have actually what we're doing in this project. We have selected a number of islands in the EU, some of the small islands, some of the bigger islands. We have installed different type of renewable energy capacities and energy storage in the small islands, and have tested them of how they work in combination with how the people are using this type of different technology in private residences and public buildings and small industrial parks. And then we are replicating this for bigger islands in the EU, and will deliver a type of planning, decarbonization plan for the future of this island. So the islands are there are La Graciosa in Spain, which is a small island located in the Atlantic Ocean. Then we have Mallorca, and then you have the island of Gotland here in Sweden, where I am based, and we are based, our department. And then the island of Lesbos in Greece, the island of San Pietro here in a small island south of Sardinia, Italy, the Isle of Wight in the UK, and the La Réunion Island overseas in the Indian Ocean in France. So the different islands are very small. La Graciosa, this is a logarithmic scale. La Graciosa is an island that has a population of less than 1,000. The bigger islands have a population of almost 1 million. So we are actually installing different type of technologies, testing these different types of technologies in these 3 smaller islands here in Spain, Ireland, and Italy. And then we are replicating these plans for the bigger islands in Sweden, Greece, the UK, Spain, and France. And this is the whole idea, that we have all type of research and implementation. Starts with the data analysis and then the energy planning. Then we have the specific analysis we need for different type of criteria to evaluate these different technologies. Then we perform a multi-criteria decision analysis of these technologies, and to rank the different technological scenarios or portfolio of scenarios that we have already developed. So first, we have different type of supply and demand data for the smaller islands, and we have an evaluation of the different available renewable energy resources on the islands and the different technologies that could operationalize these resources in the electricity grid. Then we do forecasting for how the energy demand is going to look like in the future for the next 20 to 30 years. And we develop different type of scenario to balance demands and supply, and we optimize them. Then we calculate the levelized cost of energy to identify how expensive it will be to produce the unit of kilowatt hour in each one island. We do a sensitivity risk analysis, and we couple it with environmental and social assessment. Then we integrate all of these criteria under a multi-criteria decision analysis in order to identify what will be the most optimal solution that will take at the same time into account technological, economic, environmental, and social criteria. And then we rank this scenario based on different preferences of potential stakeholders that users might have. So I jumped in one. So this is that the first results of this work have already been published in scientific journals. So we have developed the platform and the application in some small islands, and that was the focus of this paper. So we focused on the data analysis and energy planning, and then the economic and sensitivity and risk analysis of this. The findings of this first part of the research could be summarized that first of all, the batteries are very expensive today. So significant battery inclusion in most of the cases make the scenarios uncompetitive, but there were some small cases that they didn't make them uncompetitive, that depending on the particular scenario and the particular size of the batteries included. The method to calculate the levelized cost of energy had a relatively small impact on the results. So the economist analysis could actually choose any available calculation of the levelized cost of method found in international literature, and that will fit. Large areas of the island study were close to renewable energy development due to a number of environmental constraints and regulatory restrictions that had to be taken into account in order to identify the specific spots to locate renewable energy projects. The levelized cost of energy values that were identified for the small areas were higher than the electricity price offered in this island so far. But in several cases, they were actually below actual production costs. And this has happened because current electricity prices in all of the small islands considered were highly subsidized. So the people that were living outside the islands in the different countries, they were actually paying for the people in the island to enjoy lower electricity prices. So a full deregulation of the market would actually include a vast increase of the price of the kilowatt hour produced in every and consumed in every of the islands. So this type of project will actually be economically beneficial as well. So the further application of the network included the multi-criteria analysis. So all of these different scenarios that we have developed that included different type of renewable energy sources like wind, photovoltaic, and storage different capacities, including electricity and thermal storage in different type of combination. They were coupled with an environmental and social analysis. Environmental analysis included the criteria of CO2 emissions saved over the life cycle analysis of the project. So we considered the whole cradle-to-grave environmental burden that the production, manufacturing, transport, installation, and decommissioning of every wind park or photovoltaic park installed on battery, etc., on the specific islands, and we compare it with the CO2 emissions saved over the life cycle, operational life cycle of the project itself. At the same time, we have calculated the contribution to local employment from the installation, operation, and decommissioning of all of these projects, gather it, and under a multi-criteria framework, weight the criteria in different type of ways based on the preference of local stakeholders, and rank the scenarios at the end. Whoop. So we have found out that the different islands, we have different opportunities actually in terms of levelized cost of energy assessment, and in terms of the CO2 avoided, the total energy yield produced, and the employment creation. For some of the islands, it was even environmental harmful to install different type of renewable energy technologies, because if we calculated the CO2 avoided on a life cycle basis, we have negative CO2 emissions, like for example here for the island of Gotland. And the different other conclusions regarding the levelized cost of energy were also interesting to find out. I will summarize them in the next slide. So, sorry about that. So this is an example of the ranking of some of the scenario for the San Pietro Island in Italy and for Gotland Island in Sweden. So in San Pietro, this is a small island. We have developed 4 different types of renewable energy scenario. And you can see that the scenario number 4, which was the biggest scenario in terms of installed capacity, was more or less dominant in all different type of criteria. So with all criteria having the same weight, we have scenario 4 prevailing, and then with the energy criteria and the levelized cost of energy and the employment criteria, also we had this scenario prevailing, and for one criteria here, we have it almost prevailing. For Gotland, it was a different case. So we had scenario number 1 prevailing in most of the criteria, but not in the employment criteria. So in order, if we wanted to find a solution that will satisfy everybody, it was literally impossible. So the solution should be a compromise solution, and this type of multi-criteria analysis of this would pave the way towards identifying this type of compromise solution. So the results from this extensive application for the multi-criteria analysis for the islands will give that if you can connect to a grid, do it, first of all, because the batteries will increase so much the cost that it will make any type of scenario economic and compatible. The batteries tend also to have a very high carbon cost at the moment, which comes from the manufacturing stage. Electricity autonomy doesn't necessarily mean high local job creation and high CO2 savings. It depends a lot of where are you going to install the different renewable energy capacities. For example, in Sweden, but we have an electricity system with low carbon intensity because we based here the electricity production a lot on hydro power, wind power, and nuclear energy that they are carbon free in terms of operation. Trying to make the island of Gotland independent and electricity autonomous will actually result in negative CO2 emissions because of this. And autonomy still can rank favorably in some specific conditions, given that cost isn't the weighted criterion, and given that the electricity system in which that the island is going to be assumed is not a low carbon cost in the system. Overall, the platform at the end informs and captures the key point for local island planners and policymakers, and we have hoped that this platform will pave the way for the planners of the future to make a consistent and integrated evaluation of all different types of criteria in order to try to make islands or islandic grids energy independent and carbon free. The next step of this application of this framework is to vary the different methods to analyze the impacts. For example, use variety of different multi-criteria methods and optimization methods to develop the different scenario, include different type of technologies, and also include electrification of transport and industry as an additional parameter of the analysis. So in order to fully account for a system 100% based on electricity. A wider application of the REACT framework to energy island in the mainlands and in islands and then islandic areas outside the EU would also be of interest for us. And as one of the presenters, Murodbek, mentioned in his presentation, we need to integrate it, perform for an integrated evaluation of these different type of technologies for islandic autonomous islandic grids in the mainland in countries like Kazakhstan and the main Asian countries. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that I gave you a short and comprehensive presentation of what we have been doing and what is the relevance of the research undertaken here at Uppsala University in relation to the Central Asian countries. Stella.
Thank you, Heracles. It was indeed very comprehensive and very interesting. I have many questions on this, but I'll give the floor to the audience first. So, Stefane, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heracles. I think that's really interesting, and I think it opens a bit the Pandora box with this island. And you said about this carbon, how about negative or positive, and the batteries, and what's the CO2 out of it. My question is like practical, because having been now in the summer in Greece, but not only in Greece, in some South Mediterranean countries that they have the islands, and it's not about the autonomy, it's about like settling some windmills there by connecting it to the grid and then to the national grid. So it's not going for the islands themselves. It doesn't go for the islands, it's go for the grid. And you have seen there is a lot of revolt, there is a lot of confrontation. So how could we handle the situations there?
Thank you for the question, Stefanos. What we have found is that just installing additional renewable energy capacity on islands or independent islandic grids does not necessarily need to decarbonizing these systems. That was a finding that we specified for a number of different islands, including the REACT project. In many cases, it was the case that by increasing the installed capacity and make a connection or a limited capacity in combination with demand-side management could lead to decarbonizing of the system. But that was only a very small window that was there for this opportunity. In general, one may identify specific scenario, coupled renewable energy scenario, coupled with adequate storage and connection to the grid, and at the same time have some time of demand side management, which is the hard part of the process, because this will include all the users changing their behavior, which is something that is not so easily achieved. Nevertheless, I understand the concerns of many local people that they do not want that their islands become net energy exporters in expense of the environmental quality of the local areas. So this is what the REACT project is also partly trying to tackle by putting multi-criteria decision analysis tools, specific tools, to try to decompose the issue at hand and the different type of criteria and dimensions, and to include the preferences of a wide variety of decision makers in the actual decision making exercise. It remains, of course, that the final decisions will be taken by public politicians and our public decisions. And these tools will help this type of people to take appropriate decision based on their criteria.
Thank you, Heracles. Thank you, Stefano, for your question. Next in line, Murodbek, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation, and a lot of details in there. My question actually follow-ups to that of Stefanos about the practicality. And since these multidimensional criteria, there's someone who sets those criteria, and it is targeted on who basically defines these criteria and what those criteria are. And given that, there is a lot of debate, especially in the indigenous domain, where a lot of the small tribes, these communities end up being located in the areas where these large-scale renewable energy technologies such as solar or wind are being installed, and then these local people are being forced to move away from their lands. So the question that I have is that even though we include these criteria in the models, it's those who have the power and who sit at the tables that can define what those criteria are. And usually these small communities are not part of the discussion and not part of the models. So what would you say to address this big gap? Of course, it's technically, I assume it's possible, but since we are in this policy discussion, would you weigh in on the policy aspect of bringing these voices into the models, so to say? Thanks.
Thanks for Murodbek for this question. This is, of course, a very difficult question to answer, and there is no unanimous and perfect response to this. Nevertheless, depending on the regulatory conditions, there is an opportunity to include even the voice of the minorities in this type of decision-making exercises, that they can influence the outcome. For Sweden, for example, there is a type of multi-criteria decision analysis approach to locate wind farms in rural areas. So the rural people and the people that will live with the windmills nearby, they have what we call a veto in this process, and this is a right that it is regulatory and legislatively accepted. So these people can really deny this project, and the project can just stop. This is how Swedish legislation is incorporating the right of the minority to maintain their position in society. And this is a very good example that maybe could be used elsewhere. Nevertheless, this has opened a lot of rejections and a lot of stopping of different type of plans that they created other different problems in that area and national as well. But as I already said at the beginning, there isn't a way to keep everybody satisfied in public policy, and there are always winners and losers, but this type of methods will try to decompose the problem, identify the winners and losers, and try to remedy any type of difficulties and problems that any project will impose on local people.
Thank you, Heracles. May I take advantage of the last 3 minutes left for a question? I understand that the project is about islands in the European Union, but I was wondering whether you have tried this analysis on island states where potentially the role of energy security, the importance basically would be very higher. So in this regard, they would go for independency despite the CO2 emissions related to this choice. That's
a very good idea for the next project, Stella. This is what I'm thinking right now. Because at the same time,
we are working in these topics on island state energy security and decarbonization efforts. And it would be very interesting to see how in this context your model would work.
I think that this is a very good idea for some further research for the future. That this will mean practically for us, as I'm thinking now, that it's going to be another criterion, the energy security, that will be embedded in the multi-criteria decision analysis, and it will have a high weight. Or it can be a veto criteria that unless you fulfill this criterion, then the scenario can be considered as a plausible scenario. Then this, of course, is a slightly different way to structure the problem, even though with the same type of methodology. And of course, you may have different results. But that will be interesting to see what you're doing and to identify common ground of research for the future.
Thank you, Heracles. Very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. If no other comments and questions? No? Then I give the floor to myself. I'm the last presenter in this. And I have this difficult task of keeping the interest after so many interesting and useful presentations. So hopefully you will find our work also interesting. Let me share my screen with you. So our work is a bit of a foresight exercise. What we are basically trying to do, okay, let me enter this in full screen mode. And if you can confirm that you can see my full screen. Okay, thank you. So what we are trying to do here in our paper that I'm jointly working on with Vasiliki Kosmidou from the Hellenic Hydrocarbon Resources Management Authority in Greece and Matteo Ranalli from Marine Planners in Italy, is a foresight exercise, keeping in mind the Green Deal announcements of the European Union and the future ahead for the Mediterranean region. What we are trying to do, and what is the motivation basically of our paper, is the announcements of the European Green Deal and Europe's aim to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. We wish basically to understand how these announcements and how these targets ahead will impact on the development, on the socioeconomic, environmental, technology development and maritimization of the Mediterranean region. Why we focus on the region? Because it's a region of high social, economic, and of course, geopolitical interest. And it's also an extended neighborhood part of the European Union that plays an important role, not only for the countries surrounding the Mediterranean, but also for the European economy as a whole. We want to look at past developments, and basically this is what we're trying to do. We look at the past developments with regards to resource exploration and exploitation in the region, and on the maritimization of the Mediterranean. And we are trying to see how these pictures and how these trends will evolve in the future. Now, the starting point of this work has been part of my work for the project of the Plan Blue on the Mediterranean to 2050. This is a foresight exercise where we are trying to shape, to design, to foresee the future ahead of us for the region. Of course, this is what I'm going to present here is not part of this project. It's just that the idea came from this project. What we are presenting here is individual work and our team's work on the analysis, on the socioeconomic and future analysis of the region. What is the methodology that we follow? Two-step approach. First, we have a thorough look at the literature to date, at the interdisciplinary literature and at the literature coming from different aspects, analysis aspects on the Mediterranean region. So we have been looking at the technology-related, policy-related, socioeconomic related literature on the region of the Mediterranean. And through this, we have tried to identify what have been the overtime trends in terms of cooperation and development in the region, and whether scientists and experts so far have been able to identify or to propose ways forward for the region as a whole, keeping in mind the regional and the global targets with regards to climate change and sustainability transition. Now, as you understand, this second part of the literature is less populated because all this energy transition, sustainability transition is, and of course the Green Deal is very new. And this is where we feel that we add with and support the existing knowledge with our work. So basically we're introducing a new element in the future analysis that has to do with the targets as detailed in the European Green Deal. So this has been the first part of our methodology. The second part that has been following also the data analysis of what we have to date on the socioeconomics of the region. We have tried to design alternative visions and scenarios for regional cooperation and development, and we have tried to assess these scenarios with a SWOT analysis, keeping in mind the potential strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats that each of these scenarios comes with for the Mediterranean countries. So basically, we want to discuss and to analyze the entire scope of potential outcomes in the region as the result of sustainability and energy transition and as a result of the Green Deal priorities. We are not saying that we can predict the future. What we are trying to do here is to illustrate, to plot alternative visions and to highlight in each of these cases what are the pros and the cons and the potential for development and cooperation for the countries that shore the Mediterranean. A bit of history background, and just to give you, to remind you that this is still work in progress. So we have done a lot with regards to data collection and analysis of the state as of now. And we are still working on the scenario analysis and the SWOT analysis of these alternative visions. So first of all, a bit of history review and a current state of affairs. Forgot to mention here, and I need to mention this now, that basically, since we are talking about energy and sustainability transition, we focus on three main elements that we consider will be detrimental for the developments in the region. And those are the exploitation of conventional resources that are very important for some countries in this part of the world, the potential development of renewable energy sources in the Mediterranean, and also the exploitation of deep sea wealth and mineral wealth in the Mediterranean region that may result from the increasing need for rare earths and critical materials, and also from the ever-increasing dependence of the European Union on imports on these products. So starting with what we know best as of now, hydrocarbon exploration and production in the Mediterranean region. Here we have a very mixed image. We have the south and southeast of the Mediterranean that is characterized by the presence of countries that have a long experience with oil and gas production, and they have a strong infrastructure in place, and their economies are somehow very dependent on oil and gas. On top of these countries, we have new entrants in the game, such as Israel, Cyprus, and also Greece that is trying to explore its hydrocarbon potential, although with slow progress. Nevertheless, we have these large findings in the Southeast Mediterranean that, according to the announcements of the countries, will be exploited. But nevertheless, looking at the prospects for these fields and looking the robust shift that Europe has taken in this regard, we consider that these kind of projects are highly questionable first and put at high risk these countries with regards to carbon lock-in and energy diversification, energy sources diversification, timely diversification for these countries. On the northwest shores of the Mediterranean, we have a completely different image. We have countries that are less interested in oil and gas exploration, despite being still consumers of conventional fuels. However, they have announced the intentions to completely leave oil and gas out of their investment priorities, their exploration priorities, and of course, these conventional energy sources will play a diminishing role over time in their energy mix. So in terms with regards to hydrocarbon exploration and production in the region, what we find is that we have two clearly separated parts of the Mediterranean that have conflicting interests with regards to exploration and production, but also have one common ground of action. And that emerges from their commitment to the UN Paris Agreement and also to the Paris Agreement, to the Climate Paris Agreement, and also to the UN Agenda to sustain and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So it's really interesting to think how these different parts with different priorities will merge together in the end, will coexist and co-develop a plan so as to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, achieve the global climate targets, and also comply with the European Green Deal. And here a question would be why this is of importance for the South Mediterranean shoring countries, because they are not EU members and they are not directly involved in the Green Deal. However, keeping in mind that these are very important trade partners, any developments in the European Union that have to do with energy transition and energy imports will have a direct impact on these countries. Now, a second area that we look in our analysis and we have examined is the potential for offshore energy production in the Mediterranean and also deep sea mining and exploration of underwater resources of the Mediterranean. Of course, developments are much more advanced in the offshore energy production front. Here we have quite a few studies that depict the ability of the Mediterranean to produce offshore energy. And of course, we have an advanced discussion even at policy level and at investors level about potential locations where this offshore potential could be exploited. And of course, we have announced offshore wind energy production projects, and these again are located in those countries, those parts of the region that have announced decarbonization, strong decarbonization efforts, and have made all these necessary steps so as to deploy renewable energy sources. And of course, we don't have yet this development of offshore wind potential in the south east part of the Mediterranean. There is some talks in Greece, but basically this is what we have as of now. With regards to deep sea mining, here developments are less strong. And here the main issues are related to the technological capacity to exploit the seabed. And also the lack of information that we have with regards to the environmental impact of these technologies. However, we know that the Mediterranean is a potentially very rich region in terms of the deep sea minerals and critical and rare earth materials. And keeping in mind that the European Union is very dependent on imports for these goods, for these resources, there is a valid argument to say that potentially we will see some interest on the seabed of the Mediterranean in the years to come. We don't have here yet any commercial projects. We have just announcements, and we follow this closely. And the fact that these announcements or the debate in this matter is intensifying, and the technological innovation will allow for the economic exploitation of the seabed, gives us some ground to consider also this potential on how this is going to develop and what are the implications of deep sea mining development in the Mediterranean region. So having this image in front of us, we have tried to develop alternative visions, potential alternatives. And this design has been along two axes. The first is the sustainable maritimization of the Mediterranean axis, where we basically measure the net offshore wealth change, while in the horizontal axis, we address aspects of cooperation, Euro-Mediterranean cooperation and integration. You see here my young researchers that are helping me in this, and they want to present with me as well. Looking at these two axis, we focus on alternative visions of infrastructure, technology catching up, environmental conditions, intra-regional cooperation, climate change impact, and prospects of carbon lock-in in the countries. And here is where the real contribution of our work comes. I know it's a very condensed slide, but I will try to give you the basic of this. Basically, we have 4 distinctive scenarios, and in between we make discussions of potential changes and deviations from these scenarios. The first scenario that we examine is the so-called bright marriage scenario, where we have a high maritimization of the Mediterranean with very strong Euro-Med cooperation. And basically what we achieve here is a very good design of the economic zones and very strict and efficient marine spatial planning that is basically in line with all the sustainable development goals and energy transition imperatives. And basically here we have a strong support from north to south with regards to decarbonization and move away from oil and gas. And all this happens in an environment where it ensures socioeconomic development and biodiversity preservation in the region. In the second scenario that we call Island of Glory, we have still high maritimization, but we have fragmented cooperation between the EU and the Mediterranean countries. And this is basically have to do with the fact that we already see some divergences in terms of targets and policies that have been developed in different regions of the Mediterranean, different countries of the Mediterranean. The problem here that we see in our analysis is that we can have a divergence in terms of development path, scope, and also the ability to upgrade know-how, technology, and capacity to innovate in both shores of the Mediterranean. In the less favorable conditions and scenarios of the future that we discuss in our paper, we have the sluggish duo scenario, where we have basically a very low sustainable maritimization of the region, but in a cooperation way. So basically we have the willingness to cooperate, but both of the cooperating parties, whether we're talking about the South Mediterranean and the European Union countries, fail to materialize the promises, the targets, and also fail to unlock the untapped potential of this collaboration and of the environment, the socioeconomic environment and in the Mediterranean. And the worst case scenario that we examine in our work is the bleak scenario, where basically we have neither strong cooperation nor strong maritimization of the Mediterranean region. And this has to do with the lack to coordinate the actions, the lack to exploit the economies of scale and scope that may emerge from cooperation and alignment in the targets and the goals of the countries in the Mediterranean. And of course, this relates to very strong, to poor basically infrastructure upgrade and intra-regional cooperation that can lead to socio-economic improvements in the region. Now, the preliminary SWOT analysis that we have done, and to conclude with this slide, shows that indeed all these potential scenarios may be the future vision of the region. But in any case, we need to consider policy imperatives and policy priorities that can coordinate the action in the Mediterranean countries, especially with regards to carbon lock-in, industrial silos, gaps between the developed and developing countries, and also coordination between the global north and south. If these kind of obstacles that are common to all countries that are trying to achieve sustainable energy transition, and also common to all the EU countries that are trying to meet the Green Deal targets, then we will face not only a regional, but also a wider area issue of meeting these targets and having equal, fair, and target-meeting development in the Mediterranean region. We find this work that will be quite important for policymakers and also for industrial clusters in the region, because basically it highlights the priorities and also the dangers that exist there in different areas from a multidisciplinary perspective. Trying to be on time, I finish here, and I'm open to questions and comments. Stefan, I see your hand only, so please.
Yes. No, thanks. No, I think there is a dropout because there are the other guys flowing to the other session. But I'd like to ask you something about Mediterranean, because that's quite an interesting focus. I mean, what's practically the negotiating power of the Mediterranean countries? For instance, last year, you remember that the barrel oil was like people were paying to keep the oil in the tankers, right? It was like a year ago, and the oil had a negative price. That was going -10. This day, or I don't know, yesterday I checked out, it was like $83. So how can we somehow forecast what's going to happen? And you see, I mean, people are revolting and they say, for instance, in Greece or South Italy or Spain, get out from the oil and gas because it's not any more beneficial. The other day say now the barrel is $90 getting the oil and gas. How these countries can react and what's their negotiating power essentially?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. I think with regards to the energy market, what we see as a shock this year and also what we saw as a shock last year with the COVID outbreak, in my view, is just a short-term imbalance that is recorded in the market. Over time, these imbalances will be addressed and will be eliminated simply because the supply and demand interactions will lead to a new equilibrium level of production and demand. And also we need to keep in mind that now we are in a transition stage with regards to energy input to power production. To the extent that we will see the increasing share of renewable energy technologies over time, we will also potentially see a decreasing risk that is related to oil and gas. But still our systems are very much dependent on conventional energy sources, and shocks like the pandemic, that it was a demand side shock, or now the shock with the high energy prices that we're experiencing now, that is a supply shock, will be eliminated. Now, it is true that the countries that produce hydrocarbon resources in the Mediterranean are not the largest providers of oil and gas for the European region. They are important to some countries, for instance, Libya for Italy, but that's it really much. So I wouldn't say that the primary interest for these countries from the European Union is related to their energy resources. It's much more related to what the European Union calls a renewed neighborhood policy. It's a matter of achieving socioeconomic development in these countries so as to have prosperity, peace, and lower risks of unexpected socioeconomic shocks, whether it's migration, whether it's shocks in supply of goods and services from these countries that enter the European Union. So I think the real bargaining power for these countries is not related just to the oil and gas reserves that they may have. For some countries, this is important. For instance, for Egypt, for Libya, it's an important bargaining tool, but it's not the only one. What they have in hand and they can use to negotiate with Europe is the fact that they are still at the spotlight of the neighborhood policy of the European Union. And they have to take advantage of that. Thank you.
Thanks,
Any other comments or questions? Good. Thank you all very much. If any comments or questions, more than happy to address via email. Thank you all for your interest in this session, and thank you the presenters. We have learned a lot, and it seems that there is still a lot of work to do ahead for all of us. So very nice to see that. Thank you, Stefane, for this opportunity, and lots of success in the next session.
Thank you for
bye to all. Good afternoon. Bye.
Yes. Bye. Goodbye.
Bye.